My wife said my needs weren't her priority and treated me like staff. I stopped funding her lifestyle, let reality hit, and watched image collapse. When she said, "Your needs aren't my priority," I knew everything was about to change. But what she didn't know was that I was about to make her so-called priorities completely unsustainable. It was a Wednesday evening and I'd just gotten home from a long day at work. The house was a mess, dinner wasn't even started, and she was getting ready to head out for her third girls' night that week. When I mentioned that maybe we could spend some time together, or that I was hoping for a home-cooked meal after working 10 hours, she didn't even look up from applying her makeup. That's when she said it, those 7 words that would echo in my head for weeks: "Your needs aren't my priority." She said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Then she grabbed her purse and walked out the door, leaving me standing there in our kitchen like some kind of afterthought in my own home. For months, I'd been watching this transformation happen slowly. She had joined a new social circle of women who seemed to think marriage was some kind of burden to escape from every chance they got. Book clubs that were really wine nights, yoga classes that turned into shopping trips, weekend getaways that I was somehow never invited to even though my credit card always seemed to fund them. I used to think I was being supportive. When she wanted to take up photography, I bought her a $1,500 camera. When she decided she needed a girls' trip to recharge, I handled all the household responsibilities and picked up the tab. When she started a new fitness routine that required expensive supplements and gym memberships, I adjusted our budget to make it work. But somewhere along the way, supporting her dreams turned into bankrolling her complete disregard for our marriage. Every conversation became about what she wanted, what she needed, what she deserved. And if I dared to express my own needs or feelings, I was being needy, controlling, or unsupportive of her growth. The breaking point came that Wednesday. I'd had a particularly rough day dealing with a difficult client, and all I wanted was to come home to my wife. Instead, I came home to chaos and indifference. When I tried to communicate my feelings, she made it crystal clear where I stood in her hierarchy of importance. As I stood in that empty kitchen, looking at the pile of dishes she'd left behind and listening to her car pull out of the driveway, I felt something shift inside me, not heartbreak, not anger exactly, but clarity. Perfect, cold clarity about what needed to happen next. I'd spent years making her life comfortable, convenient, and financially possible. Every priority she claimed to have was built on the foundation I provided: her social life, her hobbies, her freedom to pursue whatever caught her fancy that week. It all existed because I made it possible. She wanted to make it clear that my needs weren't her priority. Fine. I was about to show her exactly what happened when her priorities lost their primary source of support. What she'd failed to realize in her declaration of independence was simple. I wasn't just her husband. I was the infrastructure that made her entire lifestyle possible. That night, as she posted photos of her girls' night on social media while I ate a sandwich alone, I started making a list: every bill I paid, every convenience I provided, every way I made her life easier so she could focus on her so-called priorities. It was a long list, and by the time I finished writing it, I was smiling for the first time in months. She thought my needs weren't her priority. Tomorrow, I'd start showing her what it looked like when her priorities weren't mine either. The next morning, I woke up with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. While she slept in until noon, recovering from another night of prioritizing everything except our marriage, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and really examined the financial reality of her so-called independence. The numbers were staggering. Her monthly girls' nights alone cost more than most people's car payments. The premium gym membership she insisted she needed, $200 a month. The organic meal delivery service that she claimed saved her time for more important things, another $300. Her photography hobby had evolved into a $5,000 equipment collection that sat gathering dust in our spare room. But it wasn't just the big expenses. It was the 1,000 little ways I'd been enabling her lifestyle without even thinking about it. I paid for the premium streaming services she used to binge-watch shows with her friends. I covered the higher electric bill from her constant need to have the house at the perfect temperature. I even paid for the special organic skincare products she ordered online every month. Then there were the services I provided personally. Every morning I made sure her car had gas and was clean. I handled all the household maintenance. When she needed something, picked up, dropped off, or dealt with, I was the one who adjusted my schedule. I'd become her personal assistant, and she'd become so accustomed to it that she'd forgotten it wasn't automatic. The most revealing part of my audit was realizing how much of her social status depended on things I provided. Her friends envied her freedom to pursue her interests, not knowing that freedom was subsidized by a husband she had just declared irrelevant. They admired her spontaneous lifestyle, unaware that someone else was managing all the boring adult responsibilities that made spontaneity possible. She'd created this image of herself as an independent woman living her best life, but the foundation of that life was entirely dependent on me continuing to play the role of the invisible support system. The irony was delicious. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she finally emerged from the bedroom, still in her pajamas, scrolling through her phone to catch up on whatever drama had unfolded in her social circles overnight. She barely acknowledged my presence as she made herself breakfast, already planning her next outing. "The girls want to try that new brunch place this weekend," she announced, not asking, just informing me of another expense I'd presumably be covering. "It's supposed to be amazing, but it's a bit pricey." "Sounds fun," I replied, making notes on my laptop. She assumed I was working, which technically I was just not the kind of work she expected. That afternoon, I started making some calls. First, I contacted our credit card companies to add spending alerts for any purchase over $50, not to block anything yet, just to be informed. Then I called our joint bank accounts and set up notifications for all transactions. I wanted to see exactly how much of my money was funding her priorities. The pattern became clear immediately. Coffee shop visits, boutique purchases, parking fees for her social events, subscription services I'd never even heard of. Her financial footprint was like watching water disappear through a sieve, and I'd been the one constantly refilling the bucket. But the real revelation came when I started tracking her time. For someone who claimed to be too busy to prioritize her husband's needs, she had an impressive amount of time for everything else: book club, yoga, shopping, lunch dates, weekend trips, spa appointments, photography walks that never produced any actual photography. I began documenting everything with the precision of an accountant: every dollar spent, every hour invested in her priorities, every convenience I provided that she took for granted. By the end of the week, I had a comprehensive picture of just how unsustainable her lifestyle would be without my support. The best part was that she had no idea any of this was happening. She was too busy posting about her fulfilling life and her journey of self-discovery to notice that someone was quietly taking inventory of what made that journey possible. Friday night, she announced another girls' night, this time at some upscale restaurant downtown. As she got ready, humming and clearly excited about her evening of prioritizing everything except our marriage, I made the final calculations on my spreadsheet. Her monthly lifestyle costs were more than most people's entire salaries, and that didn't even include the hidden costs of my time, effort, and constant availability to handle whatever she didn't want to deal with. As she kissed me goodbye, a quick peck on the cheek, like I was her roommate instead of her husband, I smiled back. She thought she'd put me in my place with her little declaration about priorities. What she didn't realize was that she'd just given me permission to rearrange mine, too. Monday morning, the real education would begin. Monday morning arrived like the first day of a new job. While she slept off another weekend of prioritizing her social life, I quietly began implementing what I'd started calling Operation Priority Check. The changes started small and strategic. First, I canceled the premium streaming services she used for background noise during daily phone calls with friends. When the organic meal delivery service charged our card that Tuesday, I called and canceled the subscription. Her expensive gym membership, I removed my payment authorization and let them know she'd need to handle her own billing going forward. I wasn't being vindictive. I was being practical. If my needs weren't her priority, then funding her priorities wasn't mine either. The beauty of my approach was that none of these changes were immediately obvious. She had enough meals in the freezer to last a few days, enough episodes downloaded to keep her occupied, and her gym membership wouldn't expire for another 2 weeks. By the time she noticed, I'd have several more adjustments in place. Next, I addressed the services I provided personally. Tuesday morning, I left for work without my usual routine of checking her car, adjusting the thermostat to her preferred temperature, or leaving her favorite coffee prepared. Small things, but things she'd grown accustomed to having handled automatically. That afternoon, she called me at work with mild irritation in her voice. "The internet seems slow today, and I can't figure out why Netflix isn't working properly." That's strange," I replied, knowing exactly why. "Maybe try calling the service provider. Can't you just handle it when you get home? You're better with that technical stuff." "I'll be pretty busy tonight. You're capable of making a phone call." There was a pause. She wasn't used to me not immediately jumping to solve her problems. "Fine, I guess I'll figure it out myself." "I'm sure you will. You're very resourceful when you need to be. By Thursday, the organic meals had run out, and she was standing in our kitchen looking confused. Did the delivery service skip this week? I wouldn't know, I said, not looking up from my laptop. You might want to check with them directly. You usually handle all that subscription stuff. I handle a lot of things that aren't priorities for you. Maybe it's time you took charge of your own priorities. She stared at me for a moment, trying to process this shift in our usual dynamic. I could see the wheels turning as she realized she'd have to either grocery shop or figure out the meal service herself. I have plans with the girls tonight, she said, as if that explained why meal planning wasn't possible. Sounds like you'll need to prioritize. Then the weekend brought the first real test. She'd planned another expensive brunch with her social circle, assuming as always that I'd cover the cost when her card was declined at the restaurant. She called me in a panic. There's something wrong with my card. Can you transfer some money to my account? What's the emergency? I'm at brunch with everyone, and my card isn't working. This is embarrassing. Have you checked your account balance recently? You know I don't really pay attention to that stuff. You handle the finances. I handle our shared expenses. Your social activities are your priority to manage. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Are you serious right now? You're going to let me be humiliated in front of my friends? I'm not letting anything happen. You're experiencing the natural consequences of not managing your own priorities. Figure it out. I hung up and turned off my phone for the rest of the afternoon. When I got home that evening, she was waiting for me with the kind of controlled anger that meant she'd been rehearsing this conversation all day. What exactly is your problem? She demanded before I'd even gotten through the front door. I don't have a problem. I'm just implementing some changes based on your feedback about priorities. My feedback? You made it very clear that my needs aren't your priority. I've decided to apply the same logic to your needs and my priorities. That's completely different. How so? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The beautiful thing about logic is that it's hard to argue with when you're the one who established the premise. This is ridiculous, she finally said. We're married. We're supposed to support each other. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I thought when I told you I needed some consideration and attention in our marriage. So this is some kind of punishment. This is me taking you at your word. You said my needs aren't your priority, so I'm adjusting my priorities accordingly. It's actually very respectful of your position. She stood there, clearly struggling with the fact that I wasn't backing down or apologizing for implementing exactly what she had declared. We need to talk about this properly, she said finally. Absolutely. But first, you might want to handle that meal delivery situation. And the gym called about updating your payment method. And I think there are a few other priorities that need your attention. As I walked past her toward my office, I could feel her staring at my back. For the first time in months, I was the one setting the terms of engagement. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally came on a Sunday morning. She'd spent the entire weekend dealing with the reality of managing her own priorities, and the frustration had been building like pressure in a kettle. I was reading the news with my coffee when she marched into the living room, clearly ready for battle. She'd obviously been awake for hours, probably making mental notes of every inconvenience she'd encountered since my adjustments began. We need to talk now. I looked up calmly from my tablet. I'm listening. This childish game you're playing needs to stop immediately. What game would that be? Don't act innocent canceling services, refusing to help with basic things, making me handle everything myself. It's petty and manipulative. I set down my coffee and gave her my full attention. Help me understand something. When you declared that my needs weren't your priority, was that petty and manipulative? That's completely different. Explain how. She started pacing, clearly agitated that I wasn't immediately apologizing or backing down. I was trying to establish boundaries about my personal growth and independence, and I'm establishing boundaries about my time, energy, and resources. How is that different? Because you're doing it to hurt me. Am I? Or am I simply treating your priorities with the same level of importance you assign to mine? The question hung in the air like a challenge. She stopped pacing and stared at me, probably realizing for the first time that her own logic was being used against her. This isn't how marriage works, she said, switching tactics. You're absolutely right. In a marriage, both partners' needs should matter. But you redefined our relationship when you announced that mine don't. I never said your needs don't matter. Your exact words were, your needs aren't my priority. Would you like me to be more specific about when and where you said that? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. "Look," she said, trying a softer approach. "Maybe I could have phrased that better, but you're taking this too far." "Am I? Let's examine what's actually happened. You wanted independence from having to consider my needs. I've given you that independence. You wanted freedom to prioritize other things. I've stopped interfering with those priorities. You wanted to make your own choices without my input. Now you can. But I can't afford to maintain everything on my own." There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. "That's interesting," I said, leaning back in my chair. "So your independence and your ability to treat my needs as irrelevant depends entirely on me continuing to subsidize your lifestyle." Her face flushed as she realized what she'd just revealed. "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant. You want the freedom to dismiss me as irrelevant, while keeping all the benefits of having me around to pay for that freedom. You're twisting everything. I'm clarifying everything. For months, you've been treating me like some kind of automated support system that exists to make your life easier while you pursue more interesting priorities. The moment that support system starts operating differently, suddenly we need to talk about how marriage works." She sat down heavily on the couch across from me, finally beginning to grasp the full scope of what was happening. "So what do you want?" she asked quietly. "I want you to understand that respect isn't optional in a marriage. I want you to recognize that my needs and feelings matter as much as yours. And I want you to acknowledge that the lifestyle you've been living isn't sustainable without partnership. If you do that, then we can discuss rebuilding this marriage on terms that work for both of us. But if you think you can apologize your way back to the old arrangement where I provide everything while you prioritize everything else, you're mistaken." She was quiet for a long moment, processing the reality of her situation. When she finally looked up, I could see the calculation in her eyes as she realized her options were more limited than she'd assumed. "This feels like blackmail." "Is consequences. The difference is that blackmail involves threats about things that haven't happened yet. Consequences involve the natural results of choices that have already been made. So you're saying I have to choose between my independence and our marriage?" "I'm saying you have to choose between treating me like I'm irrelevant and continuing to benefit from my presence in your life. You can't have both." The silence stretched between us as she grappled with a reality she'd never had to face before. Her priorities were only sustainable because someone else had been managing all the unglamorous necessities that made them possible. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "Take all the time you need. But while you're thinking, remember that I'm not going to keep funding a lifestyle that doesn't include mutual respect and consideration." As she left the room, I could see the wheels turning. For the first time in our marriage, she was going to have to decide what she actually valued more, her image of independence or the partnership that made that image possible. The ball was in her court, but I'd made sure she understood the real rules of the game. I should have expected what came next, but even I was impressed by how quickly she mobilized her support network. By Tuesday evening, the calls started coming in. First it was her sister. "Hey, I heard you and my sister are going through a rough patch. She's really upset." "We're working through some things," I replied calmly. "She says you've cut off all her credit cards and canceled her gym membership. That seems pretty extreme." "I haven't cut off anything. I've simply stopped paying for services that aren't joint household expenses. She's free to maintain any membership she values using her own resources. But she doesn't make enough to cover all that stuff on her own. Then perhaps she'll need to prioritize what's most important to her." There was a pause. "Look, I know my sister can be difficult sometimes, but completely cutting her off financially seems harsh. Did she mention why I made these changes?" "She said you two had a fight about spending time together." "Did she mention that she told me my needs weren't her priority?" Another, longer pause. She said something about needing space to focus on herself, right? So I'm giving her exactly what she asked for, the space to focus on herself and manage her own priorities." The conversation ended shortly after that, but it was just the beginning. Wednesday brought a call from her mother, this one more direct. "I raised my daughter to expect better treatment from her husband." "I'm sure you did. What specifically about my treatment concerns you?" "You're punishing her for wanting some independence in her marriage." "Actually, I'm supporting her independence by allowing her to be fully responsible for the things she's declared as priorities. That's not how marriage works. You support each other through everything." I couldn't agree more. "That's exactly what I tried to explain to your daughter when she decided my needs weren't worth considering. She's going through a difficult time trying to find herself." And I'm going through a difficult time being married to someone who's decided I'm not worth finding time for. The call ended with her mother clearly frustrated that I wasn't backing down or apologizing for my unreasonable expectation of mutual respect. Thursday brought the most interesting call of all, one of her friends from the social circle trying a different approach. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I'm worried about both of you. That's thoughtful of you. She's been really struggling lately with all these changes you've made. She had to skip our wine night last week because she couldn't afford it. That must have been disappointing for her. The thing is, we've all been talking and we think maybe you're being a little harsh. I mean, she's just trying to live her life and have some fun. At whose expense? Well, I guess I never thought about it that way. Here's what I find interesting. You're all concerned about her having to make choices about how to spend her time and money, but none of you seemed concerned when she announced that her husband's needs weren't worth considering. Those were her exact words. So tell me, why is it harsh for me to treat her priorities the same way she treats mine, but it was perfectly acceptable for her to dismiss mine entirely? The silence on the other end was telling. When people have to actually think about the logic of their position, it often doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I didn't realize she'd said that to you. Now you do. So here's my question. If you were married to someone who told you that your needs weren't their priority, how would you handle that? I guess I'd be pretty hurt. And if that person continued to expect you to fund their lifestyle while treating you as irrelevant, what would you do? I see your point. Friday evening brought the most pathetic attempt yet. She'd clearly coached her youngest sister to call and try the guilt approach. She's been crying every day. She says you've become cold and mean. Has she mentioned why I might have become less accommodating? She said you had a fight about her going out with friends. Did she mention that she told me my needs don't matter to her? She wouldn't say something like that. Ask her directly if she told me that my needs aren't her priority. Then call me back if you want to continue this conversation. The call never came back. By the weekend, the campaign had reached its peak. She'd apparently painted herself as the victim of an unreasonable husband who'd suddenly become controlling and vindictive. But the funny thing about truth is that it has a way of coming out when people start asking the right questions. Saturday afternoon, I ran into her brother at the hardware store. He approached me with obvious reluctance. Look, I don't usually get involved in this stuff, but the whole family's talking about what's going on with you two. I'm sure they are. She says you've cut her off financially and won't let her do anything. Is that what she says? Yeah, and honestly, it doesn't sound like you. You've always been pretty reasonable. Ask me anything you want to know. I'll give you straight answers. Okay, why did you cancel her gym membership? Because when I expressed that I needed more consideration and attention in our marriage, she told me that my needs weren't her priority. So I decided her gym membership wasn't mine. He stared at me for a moment. She actually said that to you, word for word? And you're just supposed to keep paying for her stuff while she treats you like that? According to your family, apparently, yes. He shook his head slowly. Man, I'd have done a lot worse than cancel a gym membership. The goal isn't revenge. It's clarity. She wanted independence from considering my needs. I'm giving her the full experience of that independence. That's actually pretty reasonable when you put it that way. The truth usually is. As I drove home, I realized that her campaign to paint me as the villain was backfiring. The more people learned the actual facts, the more they understood my position. And more importantly, the more she had to defend herself, the more she had to confront the reality of what she'd actually said and done. The support network she'd been counting on to pressure me was starting to see through her version of events, which meant she was running out of external reinforcement for her position. Soon she'd have to deal with the situation directly instead of hoping others would fix it for her. The final collapse came faster than I'd anticipated. 3 weeks after her support network started getting the real story, she was sitting across from me at our kitchen table, looking like someone who'd finally run out of options. Her photography equipment had been gathering dust for months, but now it was listed on various selling platforms. The expensive skincare routine had been replaced with drugstore alternatives. Her social calendar had been dramatically reduced to events she could actually afford on her own salary. Most telling of all, she'd started doing things around the house that she'd previously considered beneath her laundry, meal planning, actually cleaning instead of just moving things around. The woman who'd been too busy pursuing her priorities to maintain our home was suddenly finding time for domestic responsibilities. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. her voice lacking the confrontational edge it had carried for months. "And I think I understand now what it feels like to have someone treat your needs as unimportant." I waited for her to continue. "When I couldn't afford to go out with my friends anymore, and they started making plans without checking if I could come, I realized how it felt to be an afterthought. That must have been educational. When my gym membership expired, and I had to start working out at home, I understood what it meant to lose something I'd taken for granted." She paused, clearly struggling with what came next. "And when I had to start managing all the little things you used to handle automatically, I realized how much I'd been depending on you while treating you like you were irrelevant." "Go on." "I was wrong about all of it. My needs weren't more important than yours, and declaring that yours weren't my priority was cruel and unfair." I studied her face, looking for signs that this was another manipulation tactic. But the exhaustion in her eyes and the genuine humility in her voice suggested otherwise. "What changed your mind?" "Reality. Living without your support showed me that my so-called independence was completely artificial. I wasn't independent, I was subsidized. And I was taking that subsidy for granted while treating the person providing it like an inconvenience. And now? Now I want to fix this if you'll let me." The moment I'd been building toward for weeks was finally here. She was ready to have an honest conversation about our marriage, but the question was whether it was too late. "What does fixing it look like to you?" "I want to be a real partner. I want your needs to matter as much as mine. I want to contribute instead of just consume." "Those are nice words, but I've heard nice words before." "I know. That's why I'm not just offering words." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Inside were printouts showing that she'd canceled several expensive subscriptions I hadn't even gotten to yet, had started contributing a larger portion of her salary to household expenses, and had cleared her social calendar for the next month. "I want to rebuild this marriage on equal terms, not me expecting you to fund my lifestyle while I ignore yours." "And your friends? Your social circle that was so important?" I realized that most of those relationships were pretty shallow when they evaporated the moment I couldn't afford to keep up. The real friends stuck around regardless of how much I could spend. She looked directly at me for the first time in months with what appeared to be genuine respect. I also realized that I'd been treating the most important relationship in my life worse than I'd treat a casual acquaintance. And that's not the kind of person I want to be. I sat back and considered her words. The transformation was remarkable, but I'd learned not to trust quick changes. "This sounds promising, but I need you to understand something. I'm not going back to being taken for granted. I'm not going back to having my needs dismissed, and I'm not going back to funding a lifestyle for someone who treats me as optional. I understand." "Do you? Because 3 weeks ago, you were trying to get your family to pressure me into accepting disrespect. Now you're sitting here talking about equality and partnership. That's a pretty dramatic shift." It took losing everything I thought I wanted to realize what I actually needed, which is a husband who respects me enough to expect mutual respect in return. A partner who won't enable me to take him for granted. Someone who values himself enough to set boundaries. The irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to accept being treated as irrelevant, I'd apparently become more attractive to her than I'd been in years. So where do we go from here? I'd like to start over, not pretend the last few months didn't happen, but use them as a foundation for something better. I looked at this woman, who had been my wife for years, but had somehow become a stranger focused entirely on her own priorities. The person sitting across from me now seemed more like the woman I'd married than the one who'd been living in my house. "All right, but we do this with complete transparency. No more assumptions about who pays for what or handles what. Everything gets discussed and agreed upon. Yes. And if you ever again decide that my needs aren't your priority, this conversation will be our last." "Understood. Then let's see if we can build something worth having." 6 months later, we have a marriage that's stronger than it ever was before. She contributes equally to household expenses and responsibilities. Her social life is balanced with our relationship instead of competing with it. And most importantly, she treats me with the same consideration she expects to receive. The woman who once declared that my needs weren't her priority now goes out of her way to make sure I know that I matter, because she learned the hard way that sustainable relationships require mutual respect, not just one person subsidizing another's independence. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is showing them what life looks like when they get exactly what they asked for.